On in the Kyle Rittenhouse saga, a lot of people made a big deal out of the fact that Kyle was acting as private security even though he wasn't licensed. And the question came out was, can he do that? I mean, is that not against the law? And if so, what is the punishment for something like that? Well, it turns out that the situation is a little more complicated than most people think. So today we're going to look at the law about providing private security and decide, should Kyle have been prosecuted? Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dredd to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dredd Show.
So here is the statute in question. It's subchapter 2, private detectives and private security persons. And under 440.26, it states, no person may do any of the following unless he or she has a license or permit issued under this section. And one of those is act as a private detective, investigator, special investigator, or private security person. Now, of course, Kyle doesn't meet any of those except for private security person. And in all fairness, that's what he was doing. He was not acting as a law enforcement officer, so he was not a vigilante. He assumed no administrative role. I mean, he didn't try to replace the role of a cop or a judge or a jury, although some people will say, well, he executed. Those people who make that kind of claim are pretty stupid. Okay? It makes no sense whatsoever. It's really, really bad logic. But at any rate, he looks like he might be guilty of violating number 2 here. So let's take a look at what the penalties are. All right. You have to go down a ways. And by the way, the fact that Kyle was carrying a firearm actually makes this more severe. Okay? Keep that in mind. So it says here, penalties. Any person acting as a private detective, investigator, or private security person, or who employs any person who solicits, advertises, or performs services in this state as a private detective or private security person, that's important to remember as well, without having procured the license or permit required by this section, may be fined not less than $100 nor more than $500 or imprisoned not less than 3 months or more than 6 months or both. So this sounds kind of serious, right? But there's 2 elements here. One is Kyle acting as a private security person. And according to what we see in front of us here, that's against the law. There's also the issue where the Kendrys apparently hired Kyle to perform the function of a private security person. And according to what we read here, that's against the law as well. So why wasn't Kyle charged with this crime? But here is the problem with it. Binger, to nail Kyle for this, needs the Kendrys to get on the stand and tell the world that they hired Kyle to do this work, because that would make Kyle a hired private security person. You may be thinking, well, wait a minute, does he have to be hired? If the person doesn't have to be hired, then we are all acting as private security persons every time we go to bed, right? We're in charge of securing our own homes. And so I am sure that the appeals court would probably feel the same way, that this law is really aimed at those who act as private security persons for money. In other words, it's a commercial venture. So the Kendrys would have to get on the stand and say that, yeah, we did hire Kyle Rittenhouse to guard our property. But they don't want to do that, nor, and this is really important, does Binger want them to say that. Remember, Binger's whole deal about Kyle, well, not all of it, but a large part of it was that Kyle was acting recklessly, that he always got involved in things that didn't involve him. Remember all those motions that Binger filed, and they all had the same sort of motive, and that was Kyle always got into things that did not involve him. So to have the Kendrys get on the stand and say, hey, we had nothing to do with Kyle Rittenhouse being there that night. We didn't even know he was there. He just shows up and he guards that property even though we didn't ask him. That would have played perfectly into Binger's narrative. But now you can't charge Kyle with acting as a private security person because the very person that supposedly hired him is saying that he had nothing to do with Kyle being there. So at this point, Binger has a little bit of a dilemma. If he wants to nail Kyle for acting as a private security person, he has to have the Kendrys go on up there and tell everybody that they hired Kyle, but then that makes Kyle's involvement understandable, and Binger doesn't want that. So Binger made his choice. He decided that he wanted Kyle to appear as reckless, and therefore he needed the Kendrys to get on the stand and say they had nothing to do with Kyle being on the property. So could Binger go after Kyle now that the trial is over? Technically he could, but now he has to get the Kendrys up there to explain that they did in fact hire Kyle to go onto the property, and the judge will come back on Binger and say, so you put those witnesses on the stand with the understanding that they were going to lie. And that would put Binger into a lot of trouble. You just don't want to do that as a lawyer. So once Binger asked them, did you have any involvement with Kyle being there? And they said no. Binger is kind of locked into that whole scheme. So at this point, Kyle is not going to be charged for anything having to do with the private security detail. Like my video and subscribe to my channel.